Why is it, in your belief, that these analysts have been so wrong? Why is it that it wasn't just wrong on a small margin? It's been, for some of them, massively wrong. Like where Russia's not going to be able to put planes in the air. Why do you think that it was so wrong? And in that, do you mind talking about maybe some of the problems when assessing maybe the Russian economy around things that are classified and some of the propaganda that may influence the way people can assess it?
A good question. I do wonder sometimes whether or not people believe their own propaganda, is my sort of impression. Certainly when you see this sort of circulation of ideas. Let's just use sorry, I want to answer your bigger question, but you've touched on there this relationship between information war and serious analysis. And, you know, I like to think that the serious analysts don't drink from the pool of information war because it's poisoned, right? Because it's not good information, and so therefore you shouldn't be using it for making your analytical assessments. And what I think I've seen over the last 3 years is a loss of analysts, whether they be in the think tank community, whether they be in the media, you know, people who are military journalists who focus on these things. They will very often use information that was probably, almost certainly, definitely put out there by, let's say, the Ukrainians, for obvious reasons to the Ukrainians. You know, I understand why they're doing this, but then that information, which is intended to perform a certain function, is used as though it is, you know, a good, healthy, you know, fact, and then influences the type of assessment that is made. My feeling is that that's something that's happened far more than one would hope would happen with professional analysis over the course of the last 3 years. We see a lot of cherry picking. We see a lot of people looking at data points that suit them. I think the ruble depreciation recently was a good example of that. Of you look at one thing that supports your theory, that a confirmation bias, and then ignore everything else that infirms your theory, that suggests that maybe your theory is wrong, and then you stick to it. And we've seen a hell of a lot of this happening. I see it in my own interactions with different people from different walks of life. Let's just put it like that, within the analytical community. And I often wonder why it is that they're sort of repeating facts to me.
Dr. Connolly, Dr. Richard Connolly, mate, firstly, thank you so much for coming and joining the podcast. You reached out to me and I really was looking for someone, because I said multiple times, like, my knowledge base for the Russian economy is not there to speak on whether things are collapsing or not. So, mate, firstly, thank you and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Willie, for inviting me on.
Right. So for those of you who are unaware, and I'm happy to introduce you to everyone here, Dr. Richard Connolly, he was the director for the Centre of Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Birmingham in the UK until 2020. And then since then, he set up his own business, which involves advising NATO and Western governments on the subject of Russia's economy and its defence industrial capacities. Now, you and I, we're going to go over a lot in this. I've got a lot of questions. And even just in the beginning chat, I was really intrigued by what you were saying about what we've seen in the ruble, what we're seeing in the attritional aspect of the war, and the attritional warfare, as we pointed out prior, but offline. It's not just soldiers and tanks at the front. It can be, how can your economy stand up too? And what you interested me in the email you sent me was, in a nutshell, my view is that the Russian economy is, despite a few complications, well equipped to carry on the war at its current intensity. In fact, I'd wager that it could go up a gear or two if it needs to. So the wishful thinking that we currently see concerning the ruble depreciation is just that. It's wishful thinking. So what do you make, Dr. Connolly, about the idea that the ruble is collapsing and that the Russian economy, as we hear on Twitter, is collapsing, that it's all over?
Well, I think the recent depreciation of the ruble is perhaps only the latest episode in sort of faulty analytical thinking on Russia. It really goes back to the very beginning of the war. And I'll take you back a little bit in time before coming up to date now and talking about what's happened with the ruble. But just to give a sense of how I think a lot of analysts have got it wrong on the Russian economy since the war began. If we go back to almost 3 years ago, after the full-scale invasion began, and after a pretty draconian set of sanctions were put in place on Russia in the aftermath of the invasion, we saw a lot of very dire predictions for the Russian economy. A lot of very sensible, well-regarded forecasters laid out scenarios for Russia that included things like a 15% collapse in GDP. This was back in 2022. In the end, the economy shrank by less than 2%. So that was 2022, and that was the first example of, let's just, for the sake of simplicity, call it wishful thinking. And then if we go a year after that, there was then an expectation that with things like the G7 oil cap, that would really crimp Russia's export earnings, and that Russia would begin to feel the pain in 2023 after surprising everybody the year before. And it didn't. In fact, not only did the Russian economy not collapse, it grew at a fairly healthy rate for Russia in 2023. And that enabled the Russian government to spend more on its military than at any point in the entire post-Soviet period. And it did this pretty comfortably. It was able to spend this vast amount of money whilst the economy was growing and without really having to run a very significant budget deficit. That was 2023. And then this year we've had a couple of other instances where I think analysts cherry pick some bad news and think, well, this is finally the stock clock's right. Finally, the economy's starting to show signs of strain, and that we from the West are going to see and get the result that we intended with sanctions. And earlier on in the year, and still, people are talking about the dangers of overheating. Overheating is where you've got supply constraints in the economy, in particular in the labour market. But alongside excess demand, that means the government spending a lot on the war and on other things. And that's caused inflation to rise, and it's caused shortages in the labour market, amongst other things. And there was a hope that that would also slow the economy down earlier this year. And in fact, it looks as though the economy in 2024 is going to grow even faster than it did last year. And not only is that surprised some of the more sort of analysts who are sitting there hoping that everything's going to sort of fall apart for the Russians, but it also surprised me. I'm a little bit more skeptical about these lines because I think Russia is a lot more resilient than people credit it for. But even I've been surprised at just how quickly or how fast it's managed to grow this year. So that brings us up to date. And in recent weeks, and we've seen this quite sharp depreciation of the ruble. Now, it wasn't a collapse. It was already trading at about 90 rubles to the dollar, a couple of months ago, and it's now trading at about 105. So this isn't, sort of cratering of the currency. Although if you read the press, you might have thought otherwise. But the reasons that it happened were fairly sort of explicable. There'd been some quite technical things going on in Russia's foreign exchange market, which I won't bore you or your listeners with. But they were serious, and they were to do with the most recent round of US sanctions, which targeted Russia's banking system, and they were to do with Russia's trade balance. Imports had risen in recent weeks, and exports had stayed at about the same, which leads to a weakening of the currency. But it was nothing catastrophic. It was a relatively manageable depreciation of the currency. It's likely to mean that the cost of imports rises a bit, but it's not going to. It's not. This isn't August 1998. It's not a sudden loss of all of the value of the ruble, and Russia isn't functioning completely like a market economy at the moment. So looking at indicators like the foreign exchange market doesn't really tell us a lot. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of people have made over the course of the last couple of weeks, is to assume that this indicator is communicating really meaningful information when it's not. And so, that leads me to think that what we've seen has been a bout of, it's a complication, a bout of instability, but certainly nothing serious, and nothing I think that will really be worrying the people in the Kremlin.
Yeah, well, this is something I'm so glad that you reached out, and you're like, I'm a watcher of your channel. And I was like, oh no, what have I said? But I'm so glad you reached out, because these indicators we see, you see the ruble, and you see, you know, on Google, like trends or it is, you can see the ruble, you know, looking like it's collapsing. But you can sort of zoom out and go, well, how bad is this? And what guys like me are hearing, like your average Joe, is one side is telling us that there is an imminent collapse of the entire Russian economy, which I do think many are banking on. That's the way to victory for Ukraine. And then there's a whole other side saying that Russia's economy is one of the fastest growing in the world. And this is where that, for just your average guy, is not really adding up. And you get these information coming in from both sides. You're going, well, how can they maintain this war and keep going? And the ruble's dropping. So where do you sit, I guess, on that? Like, an imminent collapse, I'm guessing, well, it's not imminent. Could we see an entire collapse in that? Or will Russia continue to sustain this effort? And as you wrote in your message to me, could they go up a gear or two?
A couple of questions contained within that. I'll answer the bigger one most simply, and that is to say, I think it's highly unlikely that you're going to see a collapse. And by a collapse, I mean a sudden and sharp reduction in economic output, you know, so a sort of a steep recession, maybe 10, 15% of GDP in a year, or even 5%. I think that's unlikely. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely at the moment. So I think my reasons for that are to do with the other part of your question is, you know, as you I think quite rightly point out, you tend to see this quite polarized sort of analytical discussion over Russia. It's either doing very, very well, but for those people who think that Russia's benefiting from sanctions, I think that that's excessive, or those who think that it's, you know, constantly on its last legs and is about to keel over. And here we are 3 years in and it still hasn't. The truth, as ever, lies somewhere in between. It isn't as simple as either of those two extremes would suggest. We've just spoken about some of the problems in the foreign exchange market, and that is a result of sanctions. Sanctions are having an impact. Anybody who says sanctions aren't having an impact is wrong. They have an impact. Whether they work is a separate question. Impacts and success are two different things. I can hit you and it might hurt your jaw, but you might still win the fight, in which case I've not had a decisive impact by hitting you. And it's the same, very similar with sanctions, but they are having a very observable impact. So the recent turbulence with the ruble is evidence of that. However, if we step back and look at the other things going on in the Russian economy, we can see that the picture is, at least from the Kremlin's point of view, more encouraging. So if we look at recent growth data, as I say, we've had 2 years now of very healthy growth by Russian standards, much faster than its pre-war average. Alongside that, we've got record low levels of unemployment. That's the other side of the coin of a tight labour market. The latest data show that Russia's got an unemployment rate of 2.3%. That's basically full employment. Anybody who wants a job in Russia has got one or can get one. Those people who are in work, I mean,
unemployment rate in like the UK.
Sorry?
For reference, what's sort of the unemployment rate in like the UK or the US?
They are round about, and it's a good question. I live in Switzerland, so I don't follow that as closely, but they're around about between 3 and 5% in most, let's say, G7 economies. Yes. More towards between 4 and 5. Okay. So 2.3 is very, very low. Right. So they're close to full employment, but not only are they close to full employment, those people who are in work are being paid more than they've been paid in the last 15 years. So real wages have gone up significantly in the last 2 years. So your average Russian, for those who are in work, and that's nearly everybody, most of them have seen their wages go up and they are spending more in the shops. So we're seeing retail sales rising, for instance, and consumption rising. We're also seeing investment increasing. And this is, you know, investment is one of the most important indicators to watch when you're looking at the health of an economy, because if you're investing at a rate faster than the rate of economic growth, it shows that you're allocating capital, financial resources, towards expanding capacity in the future. You're building more warehouses, you're building more factories, you're building more infrastructure. And Russia had a big investment problem for about 15 years before the war began. But in the last 3 years, you've seen investment growing at its fastest consecutive rate since before the global financial crisis 2007, 2008. So I've just picked a few key indicators there, just to show that the picture is a lot more mixed. Would have you believe there's some good news if you're Russian in there, there's some bad news, but I think it all amounts to a picture of an economy that is doing pretty well and is quite resilient given the array of challenges that it's facing. And then to pick the last of the questions contained in your last one, you spoke about whether or not, well, you asked me whether or not it has the capacity to go up a gear. Now, for me, when I think about that question, I'm interested in whether or not the government has the money to go up a gear, right? So I mentioned earlier that Russia is spending more on its military than it has in the post-Soviet period. Now, there are different measures, but my own measure is that Russia's probably spending about 7% of GDP on its military, and that is a lot higher than your average, than all NATO countries. But it's much lower than, for instance, what Ukraine is spending. If we look at Ukraine's military expenditure as a proportion of its GDP, that's in excess of 30% of GDP. Ukraine's fighting an existential war, and it is mobilizing, large swathes of its society to fight that war. But that comparison tells us something. Ukraine's pulling everything together to fight this war. Russia's doing it with a relatively smaller proportion of its available resources. And when I say it's got the capacity to go up a gear, I make that point for several reasons. First, if you compare Russia to its Soviet past, the Soviet Union used to spend anywhere, no one really knows. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 85, he asked how much we're spending on the defense or military, and his advisor said, we don't know. But people assessed that it was somewhere between 50 and 25% of national output. So the Soviet Union was a hyper-militarized society. Russia's not hyper-militarized yet. Again, to give a historical example, the US was spending about 7% of its GDP on the military during the Vietnam War. Right, so that's sort of where Russia is at the moment. If then we look at the budget, I mentioned earlier that Russia has managed to increase its military spending to 7% of GDP, whilst running a budget deficit of between 1 and 3% of GDP. That's sort of looking at the last 3 years. They're hoping next year to hit record military expenditure levels with a budget deficit of less than 1% of GDP. Now, if you just compare that not to the big wars of the past, but if you compare it to the US and the UK, and Afghanistan and Iraq, they're all running much larger budget deficits, fighting much smaller expeditionary wars, not this high-intensity, large-scale conflict that you see Russia fighting in Ukraine at the moment. So it seems to me that it's plausible that if Russia wanted to increase its military spending from, let's say, 7% of GDP to 8 or 9, it could do that. Now, the more it dials that up, the more strain it would put the economy under, for sure. It's not in a position where it has unlimited resources. It would have to make some tough choices about who would get less money, pensioners maybe, infrastructure spending. But if they felt that it needed to happen, perhaps because the war escalated with some form of NATO involvement, then I think it's reasonable to think that Russia would be able to do that. So, and it has low debts. It has an ability to tap state-owned banks in Russia that are sitting on vast cash piles because of high interest rates of the last year. So the fact that it can't borrow from the West, to my mind, is really not very important. It's got a lot of resources within the country that it can access if they need to. Now, so far, they haven't done that. I think that the people in the Kremlin, Putin and his advisors, are happier fighting a war at this level without having to ask society to make all sorts of sacrifices. But if they need to, it's something I think they can do.
So why is it? Because we were told these unprecedented sanctions, and I was there in the beginning of the 2022 part of the invasion, if we date back to 14, I was there, and when these sanctions were first getting hit, and people were saying, just give it time, that shockwave of the sanctions will hit and everything will start, really becoming more and more difficult for the Russians. And like you spoke about and I've spoken about is, well, it's not a fact whether the sanctions have an impact or not, but do they really work? And it does seem so far that the sanctions are having some effect. We can see the Ruble and we can see these other indicators, but it's sure as hell not the effect that we thought that we would see, where people thought, and people's idea of this was grown by the media, who were, quoting experts. Why do you think it is, in the most simple terms, that these sanctions have not had the effect that all the predictions said that they would have?
Yeah, in the simplest terms, I'm going to talk about sanctions in general here, not just those on Russia, but we know that the West, in particular the United States, has used sanctions on the likes of Iran, North Korea, Yugoslavia, even if we go back to the Cold War, the Soviet Union and South Africa. And very often what happens with sanctions is they're put in place, they have a short-term impact, and then the other side adapts, right? The target country with sanctions is a moving target. They don't sit there and simply absorb the worst effects and do nothing. They come up with all sorts of schemes and methods to try to mitigate the impact of sanctions. And for Russia in 2022, they've spent the previous 8 years under a sanctions regime, the sanctions that were put in place in 2014. I actually wrote a book about how Russia had responded to those sanctions. And that's how I sort of have, I guess, a sort of a clearer understanding of the types of preparations they were making and the types of things that they did. And they put in place a series of policies that meant that when the war began and the sanctions were put in place, even though a lot of them were unexpected and were a lot more severe than I think Moscow ever thought was likely, they nevertheless were in a pretty strong position to quickly take action. And that action reduced the impact. The most immediate impact that you see is in the first few months after the sanctions are put in place. After that, the impact has been much more modest and has diminished over time. Again, I'm not going to overstate this and say they have no impact. As I said earlier, there are specific parts of the Russian economy. LNG exports are one, the currency market is another, payments problems that Russian importers have trying to get hold of goods from outside, especially sanctions goods. They're experiencing problems making those payments because of the US sanctions. So there are all sorts of complications, but they are bearable costs, it would appear, for Russia, because whilst all that's happening, and whilst they'll top that up on the negative side of the ledger, the economy is growing, and all those other indicators that I mentioned are moving in the right direction. But the short answer is they adapt, because that's what countries do. And it's even easier in a country which is authoritarian, right? In authoritarian countries, the leadership is able to make sure that those who are hurt by sanctions are in some way compensated. So if you're close to the regime, then you'll find new ways of making money to compensate you for the fact that your yachts, in the West have been seized, or your big mansions in the south of France have been seized, or your assets in banks have been frozen. Then the regime says, well, that's okay, because we'll make other ways available to you in Russia for you to continue to make lots of money. That keeps a lot of the elite quiet. So authoritarian regimes are able to do this in a way that democracies would find it much more difficult to do.
This was actually a question that I have written on my other screen here. And it says, how do economies in a more authoritarian mixed sort of sense, like a mixed economy country, like say Russia, with more authoritarian, how do they hold up in wars, their economy, compared to your democratic capitalist countries as far as state industry and private industry? And I think you touched on that a little bit in that also.
A little bit, Willie, but I think you asking the question also raises another point, and which I think highlights another misconception about the Russian economy. I think a lot of people think that it's either a complete basket case, or it's an example of an economy where the state exercises tight control over everything. And that's not true. There's actually, although the state does play a very important role, especially in what we might call, or what Lenin would have called, the commanding heights, the oil and gas industry, telecommunications, banking, those areas which are the most important nodes of the economy. You see high degrees of state ownership, and you see the state exercising a fair degree of control. However, alongside that, you've got a pretty robust and healthy market economy. Yet millions of small and medium-sized enterprises responding to market signals. And what I mean by that is, if there's a profit to be made by importing a sanctioned good through a third country like Kazakhstan or Georgia, then middlemen will emerge whose job it is to get hold of those goods, to get hold of the Mercedes that's sanctioned, bring it into Russia, sell it at a markup to somebody who's got the money to spend, and make a profit. And you're seeing this happen on a grand scale. Lots of small and medium-sized companies responding to the opportunities that sanctions often offer, right? Sanctions have mixed effects. They create winners and losers. And if you sanction a good, then it means the price of that good goes up in a market, and they go up in Russia, the Mercedes or the Apple laptop. So for those people whose job it is to get hold of them, bring them into the country and sell them, that then can benefit that particular class of people. And in this instance, you're seeing small and medium-sized businesses registered at record levels in Russia. There's never been as many small and medium-sized businesses registered since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that some of that is caused by the opportunity created by sanctions. And that gives the Russian economy an adaptability, a flexibility. It's not just a state that has to control everything, that has to make decisions. There's a lot of decisions and a lot of adaptive action being taken by individual entrepreneurs, small and medium-sized companies, all operating beyond state control. So what you've got, and you use the word mixed, is a mix of the state, being very purposeful and trying to mobilize resources for the war, but also lots of millions of other, economic actors just wanting to make money, wanting to make a profit, and making the most out of the opportunities in front of them. And I think that's a big missing part of the story. A lot of people miss that part of the economy that is basically a market that does give Russia a lot more adaptability than people ever thought that it would have.
And I guess it gives a sense of resilience to it as well. We've got some state and some privately owned as well. But what have we seen the effect on the average Russian from sanctions, from the ongoing war, outside of the military aspect of this, but economically? Because we see and hear things that, it's now these lines up around the corner to try and pull out money, or lines, and there's nothing on the supermarket shelves. What has been if you're just an average Russian going about your day, how much impact or change have you seen to what your bank balance can or cannot buy you?
Well, you've got the headline figures, as I mentioned earlier, let's say real disposable incomes, which have performed much better over the last 2 years than they had done, even in the decade before the war began. So if we just take that very simple figure, then we would say that your average Russian is better off. Now, in practice, the truth is more complicated. Certain people have benefited from the last 2 years more than others. You mentioned the military. It's not just the military, it's also people working in the defense industry and in sectors associated with that, where the order books are high, people are working overtime, and they're being paid wages that they'd never thought that they would experience. But also, because you've got this tight labour market, other wages are going up in other sectors. We've seen a construction boom, which is fizzling out a little bit at the moment, but in the previous 2 years, a lot of people working in construction made a lot of money. Logistics, if you're a truck driver in Russia, you can make an enormous amount of money, far more money than than would have been the case before the war began. And this is true across a lot of industries. However, there are some people who will have suffered, people who operate in industries unrelated to the booming sectors, people who live in regions of Russia that have been untouched by this sort of this wartime boom, and by poorer segments who are hit harder by inflation. And inflation is a thing. We mentioned some of the good news, some of the bad news from a Russian perspective, and inflation has risen. I don't think to catastrophic levels, but as ever, inflation hits the poorest. And the poorest segment in Russia will have been and is being hit by sort of 70% increases in the price of staples like potatoes in the last year. So the picture's mixed. On average, your Russian is better off. I think these sort of pictures of empty shelves and queues are exceptions rather than the norm. I haven't been to Russia in the period since the war began, But I do watch a lot of, Russian media and news, and I think for every empty shelf you'll see, sort of whole shopping malls full of full of very happy shoppers going about spending their money. And the economic data support that. This is a growing economy with growing incomes.
Well, I guess we can see too, we talk about disposable income. And one of the biggest things I've been, I guess, pushing at, which you may have seen on my channel, is just these massive salaries that the Russian Ministry of Defense is able to pay individual soldiers. And when we adapt that to a figure that would be the equivalent in USD or Australian, we're talking like $200,000 a year. That is unbelievable. And I do many question, can Russia maintain this? But you can also see the attractiveness of a salary like that the equivalent money, there's very few places in Russia of opportunity to earn. There's very few places in the world of an opportunity to earn that much money, especially without a degree. You either pay with your brain or your body. And these guys obviously are paying with their body, sacrificing on the front line and that danger. But it's very interesting to see that the Russian government can actually afford to pay these $250,000 equivalent salaries whilst maintaining a war, especially when all we've been told is that these sanctions are going to hit, they're going to have no money, there's going to be a collapse, and no one's going to be eating. For the foreseeable future, are things like those salaries going to hold up?
Well, I think, salaries, prices tell us a lot. They're signals, and they tell us a lot about what's going on. The reason the salaries are going up is because, as I've mentioned, Russia has a labor shortage. So in order to induce, men of military age into the army, you've got to throw money at them because they've got other opportunities as well. They could work, they could keep their bodies and work as a delivery driver, in a haulage firm, in a transport company, or they could get a job elsewhere. So what they're having to do is to attract people from these other industries that are also paying quite well into the military. So you have to pay them more. And the fact that the wages are going up as high as they are, and it varies across regions. So we know that there are these signing on bonuses, bounties, and then there's your sort of wage that you pay afterwards. And then there's the compensation that's given to your family if you die, and the bonuses that are given if you perform certain tasks. So the average wage really does vary on all of those factors. What we're seeing is that, most of the men are being recruited from the poorer parts of Russia, from the far flung regions, often in the Far East, the North Caucasus, Central Asia, etc. And the closer you get to Moscow and the big cities, the more you have to pay, because these are the people with the better alternative opportunities. Now, as I say, so far the budget is such that I think, Russia has been able to afford to do this. Can it keep on paying these levels? Maybe. But I think the question is, can it pay more? Because they're going to need to pay more as the pool of available labour dries up, as the labour market becomes even tighter. And you're quite right to point to the fact that Russian military wages compare favourably to people across the world now. They also are the best paid any Russian soldier's ever been in the history of Russian soldiers, right? If you go back to the last 500 years and look at what your average Russian soldier would have been paid, it would have been peanuts. Through most of Russian, post-Soviet Russian, Soviet and pre-Soviet Russian history, they've never had it so good from a financial point of view. The question of whether it can keep paying for this, though, is the one that you're really asking. And I think where there's a political will, they will find a way. You would have 2 years ago, people would have found it amazing that you're paying millions of rubles as a signing on bonus. I used to teach in Russia for years before the war, and I was paid what was a fairly good wage by Moscow standards, an annual wage of 1 million rubles a year. Sounds great. About $15,000 back in the day. You're getting soldiers being paid 4 million rubles signing on in regions not too far from Russia at the moment. So seeing that rate of growth, seeing it being maybe 8 million rubles in a couple of years' time, to me seems maybe excessive. But we might be surprised. We've been surprised by what they've managed to do so far. Maybe they'll surprise us in the future.
And I can see that this would be raising concern for people because, as I've stated a few times in the videos, is it seems like that people are sort of putting all their chips in that a Ukraine victory comes through a Russian economic collapse. And I feel like that's where so many people are going all in, is we don't need to worry about a military victory. We just need to last long enough that we see the Russian economy not be able to sustain this effort, therefore it can't pay the soldiers. And it goes to the next topic I want to talk about, which is Russia's industrial capacity to keep these factories open and running, because as you mentioned, they're running a lot more overtime on countries either refitting out tanks or building new tanks or machinery, or just down to building uniforms and textiles. How is the industry being run at the moment? Is it able to continue ramping up, or will it plateau at some point? And not to load too much into question, but how is then the Russian export market going, the export of planes and vehicles and whatever else around the world?
Okay, we'll get on to that at the end, because the answer to that is related to the big part, which is about the defence industry's ability to deliver weaponry to the military at the moment. So if we look at some trends there and why it's managed to perform as well as it has done over the last 3 years, what you see in what we've largely seen is new output accounting for, maybe, if we take things like armoured vehicles, maybe 10% of deliveries to the armed forces. 90%, these are rough figures, and it depends on whether we're talking IFVs, APCs, tanks, whatever. So I'm just being general here for your listeners. But if we said 90% of them were refurbs, they've taken out of stocks. Russia had vast inventories inherited from the Soviet Union of munitions, of platforms that had been sitting in warehouses, sometimes in fields, in various states of repair or disrepair. And they've taken them out, they've taken them to repair factories, they've taken them to the tank manufacturers like Wagonsnavod in Nizhny Tagil, and they have then, sort of repaired them, refurbished them, put the various different kits on them, armor kits, and then sent them to the front line. And this has happened in various different forms, right? It's not uniform. There are all sorts of different types of tanks reaching the battlefield in different states. Some of them T-64s, some of them more modern T-90Ms, right? So there's a whole zoo of different weaponry that's been delivered. So, of course, what's happened is, if you do that for a period of time, you draw down on those finite resources that you've got, your artillery barrels, your tank chassis, etc. And depending on the platform that we're looking at, some of these are likely to be coming towards the end of the pool of available reserves. However, what's happened alongside that is that they have ramped up their ability to build new platforms. Right. So, if we look at T-90Ms and look at where they pop up on the battlefield, they're, before the war, they were producing maybe 56. They weren't producing more than 20 a year. T-90Ms. They were producing around about 100 T-72BVMs. These are the souped-up, modernized version of the 72 before the war. Since the wars began, we're seeing hundreds, if not thousands of these, reported on the losses and the captured. So they've obviously been able to ramp up their production of those significantly, ditto the T-90Ms. So what we're seeing is, what I think we're likely to see in the future, is less in the way of modernized and repaired platforms, and more in the way of newer systems. Now, they're not going to be available in the same quantity, and so we might see some change on the battlefield in the way in which tanks are used. Because they are, I think, going to become more scarce. You're not going to have the same quantity that we've seen over the last 2 years, because that inheritance from the Soviet period, that legacy, will diminish. It is a finite resource. It'll be replaced by modern ones. However, as you document on your channel, we see a lot of new systems emerging. Now, if let's take another type of system that wasn't produced in great numbers before the war, UAVs, in particular aerial UAVs. They were something that before the war, Russia was developing a lot of different types, but they never really entered serial production. Now they're producing if not thousands, tens of thousands a year. They've got new UAV production centers set up across the country. They've got individuals, as in Ukraine, crowdsourcing and getting hold of these things and making them themselves and then supplying them to the military. So, if we look at non-traditional weapons, I was talking about armor platforms at the beginning, and then we look at things like sort of more modern weaponry, UAVs. Russia has, due to the demands of war, suddenly become one of the world's largest producers of UAVs, which it wasn't before the war. I don't think it would have happened had the war began, but the war forced them to do this. They had to plug the gap at the beginning by importing things like the Garan from the Shaheds from Iran, but they have now developed very considerable domestic capabilities. So I think that, and then there's other areas where they've really ramped up production. We know with long-range cruise missiles, we've seen the Iskander use far exceeding what would have been pre-war production capacity. They use them on a much more regular basis now than they did before. We see this with the air-launched cruise missiles. So I think if you take it as a whole, what you see is a defense industry that has, on the one hand, benefited from the Soviet-era legacy and added new, components, new electronic systems to improve their survivability and their capabilities, but then has also built entirely new capabilities that it didn't have before the war. So we've seen a combination of innovation and exploitation of that Soviet legacy. And I think what we're seeing is a much bigger defense industry. According to official statements, they're employing over 500,000 more people in the defense industry than before the war. Now, bear in mind, they went into the war with probably the second or the third largest defense industry in the world, right? Second only to the US and probably the Chinese. And they've increased that in size. So, if the war were to end tomorrow, or even if it doesn't, Russia's got this very big defense industry that I don't think is going to go away, and they're going to need to feed it by continuing to place orders.
Yeah, it's one of these things that it just seems like so much that was being told to us in the beginning has just not come true. And I think many people are realizing this now. And you touch on something which I've been observing so much recently is things like the Iskanders, that the sheer quantity of those, and we can go back and look up articles from 2022. You can look it up on Reuters or Al Jazeera or whoever. There's one or two more waves of missiles until they're out. And on my side of the fence, that propaganda has backfired massively. For the short term, maybe psychological victory, long term, that coming not true, I think actually has more effect. Is there any particular spaces in this that you think that Russia is really coming to a sticking point? Because we heard the sanctions, when the sanctions sort of didn't have the effect, people back with that and go, no, but they're going to have an effect on high-tech weapons systems, which we haven't seen too much effect there. Is there anything in the Russian military you see that they, on the horizon or currently, are really struggling to backfill with the sanctions and the economic, maybe the downturn on the ruble?
Yeah, good question, because I think, and you make a very good point there insofar as I think on the higher tech, it doesn't have to be high tech, of course, it just has to be high enough tech. But on things like guided missiles, electronic warfare systems, we've seen plenty of evidence that they've been able to circumvent sanctions and get hold of actually what is a relatively modest number of a small volume of components that are needed to continue production of those systems. They don't seem to have suffered too much in that respect. And I think they're unlikely to in the future, especially when a lot of the tech that you need is basically commercial off-the-shelf stuff. It's not, the civilian sector is already advanced well beyond some of the technological capabilities of some of the components that they're using. So I don't see that as the blockage. Where I think there probably is a problem is in being able to deploy the type of mass that we've seen. So using munitions, artillery shells in the millions over a sustained period, which they have now for nearly 3 years. We know they've managed to bridge the gap between Soviet inventories and ramping up their own production by getting hold of North Korean shells, by getting hold of munitions from other countries that had Soviet-era stockpiles, which of course Ukrainians have done as well. The problem is those inventories, both within the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union and beyond, are finite, and they will have been drawn down a lot. And even North Korea is not going to be in a position to be able to keep this up indefinitely. And I think you will get to a point, whether it's this year, this coming year in 25, or maybe in 26, where you're just not going to have that same mass available, because even though Russia's improved and increased its artillery production capabilities, it's not going to be to the point that it can keep up that rate of fire that it has over the last 3 years. In my view, I haven't seen evidence of whole new factories being sort of built. They have expanded previous capacities, but not to the sort of Soviet era level, and they are drawing on Soviet era production at the moment. So in that respect, it seems to me that we might expect, if the war continues on its current trajectory, that at some point, maybe next year, maybe the year after, where they can't continue to deploy mass in the same way that they have done before, that they'll have to adjust the type of weapons and munitions that are delivered to the military, and then the tactics on the ground will have to reflect what's available to them. So, I think we have been wrong, and in some respects we might continue to be wrong, but in other respects, I think that those assessments that they will run out of certain things will come true at some point for certain platforms and certain munitions, and we'll probably see a change in tactics. I think we've maybe seen that. Again, you follow the tactical level far more than I do, but you don't see tanks used in the same way as which they were at the beginning. Small infantry units with these small sort of assault companies where you maybe have 2 or 3 tanks or IFVs operating. You don't see them used in the sort of idea of great vast columns anymore. Some of that might be to do with that's how you have to operate in a really ISR dense environment, but some of it might also be because there's a recognition that these things are going to be more scarce in the future. I don't know, but we are seeing that, and that might be one reason for it.
Yeah, I think you're very correct, and I've touched on this before, and you touched on something very important there about the change of tactics when there may be a shortage of other equipment. And you touched on something, and you're completely right. We're seeing Russia use small team tactics, specifically recon groups on motorcycles or in those small Chinese buggies, more and more, and seeing less of this Soviet tactic that mass is everything, just pour mass into it. We're seeing far more of that just development throughout the war, just the evolution of the war. We evolve tactics. Look at the start of World War I to the end of it. And look at any war. Just look at how things evolve on a large-scale war. And look at this. Look at where the drones began, and look at where the drones are now. And that's continually grinding. That you touch on some important bits there of maybe the year coming or the year following, that we're going to see some of these items run out. But I've got 2 bits I'd push back on that in a tactical sense. Is one, well, the tactics may just change. At this point in warfare, a limited amount of tanks, in particular tanks, I don't see as a massive problem. Like if I was trying to give weapons to Ukraine, for example, I think the Bradley IFV is far more important than any of the tanks. But the evolution of tactics will just adapt to this. But as well, something I don't think people take into account is we're seeing maybe Russia can't keep up with the massive maybe shells at the moment at the front. But that is Russia, for the majority of this war, has been on the offensive side. They have been trying to push forward and break through. So you are going to lose, or you're going to use more shells. You're going to lose more vehicles. You're going to lose this and that. And this, I think, goes into what Zelensky has said about a ceasefire, that if we have a ceasefire, this is just going to benefit Russia to fix that stopgap and maybe delay when these systems are going to run out. A ceasefire on the front line is not going to stop the factory somewhere back in Russia building or refurbishing equipment or pumping out shells. And at the same time, I think that if Russia was running very critically low on some of these bits of equipment, or they could foresee this, what is stopping them falling back into a defensive posture and using significantly less of this equipment as well? So I think that needs to come into these calculations that we're running as well.
Agreed with all of that, Willie. I would add as well, we've seen with the Ukrainians what happens when you run low on, let's say, traditional munitions, and then you adapt. So we spoke about sanctions and adaptation, and of course military warfare is also a story of just constant adaptation and to the other side's actions and the availability of certain resources. And of course, what we've seen with Ukraine when they've had shortages of munitions for indirect fires is the increased use of drones, UAVs, FPVs, etc. And you have seen that actually, an increase in the use of those by Russia as well. We've seen an increase in FABs, of course, something that you've documented. So the glide bombs, which they also have large stocks, inventories of as well. So yeah, I think that some of the discussion sometimes seems to be that, well, if they run out of certain things, then their ability or capacity to wage war will be diminished, and therefore they'll have to negotiate. Whereas in practice, what will happen is they'll just adjust how they wage war.
Yes.
They waged war using mass and using the Soviet legacy because it was there. If it's not there, then you go and find something that is there and you develop alternatives. So, I think you're absolutely right with the question and the way in which you posed it then, because I think it highlights how what we'll see is some shift. It might be tactical, it might also be defense industrial. And those two things, of course, often intersect. Certain systems are available, and that will influence what you do on the battlefield. I think you've seen that with Ukraine. I think you've seen some of it with the Russians. And I think looking to the future, you're quite right. Why do you need to replace all of these tanks? Why do you need to replace all of the BMP2s or BMP, 3s or whatever? It may be that there are other things, motorcycles or dune buggies, that you think can do the job just as well, but are much easier to get hold of. So I think the end of the Soviet legacy, or at least the diminishment of it, does not mean the end of Russia's ability to wage this war. They will just find other ways of getting stuff to the battlefield.
Yeah. Why is it, in your belief, that these analysts have been so wrong? Why is it that it wasn't just wrong on a small margin? It's been, for some of them, massively wrong. Like where Russia's not going to be able to put planes in the air, and we've seen realistically maybe 10% of the Russian air force of fighters hit, if that. Really, why do you think that it was so wrong? And in that, do you mind talking about maybe some of the problems when assessing maybe the Russian economy around things that are classified, and some of the propaganda that may influence the way people can assess it?
A good question. I do wonder sometimes whether or not people believe their own propaganda, is my sort of impression. Certainly when you see this sort of circulation of ideas. Let's just use sorry, I want to answer your bigger question, but you've touched on there this relationship between information war and serious analysis. And, I like to think that the serious analysts don't drink from the pool of information war because it's poisoned, right? Because it's not good information, and so therefore you shouldn't be using it for making your analytical assessments. And what I think I've seen over the last 3 years is a loss of analysts, whether they be in the think tank community, whether they be in the media, people who are military journalists who focus on these things. They will very often use information that was probably, almost certainly, definitely put out there by, let's say, the Ukrainians, for obvious reasons to the Ukrainians. I understand why they're doing this, but then that information, which is intended to perform a certain function, is used as though it is, a good, healthy, fact, and then influences the type of assessment that is made. My feeling is that that's something that's happened far more than one would hope would happen with professional analysis over the course of the last 3 years. We see a lot of cherry picking. We see a lot of people looking at data points that suit them. I think the ruble depreciation recently was a good example of that. You look at one thing that supports your theory, that a confirmation bias, and then ignore everything else that infirms your theory, that suggests that maybe your theory is wrong. And then you stick to it. And we've seen a hell of a lot of this happening. I see it in my own interactions with different people from different walks of life. Let's just put it like that, within the analytical community. And I often wonder why it is that they're sort of repeating facts to me. that are very clearly not facts. They are, just sort of statements that are put out there for a very different purpose than to aid analysis. One such example, and you've touched on this in some of your recent videos, of course, is casualty assessments. Of course, nobody knows how many people have been killed in action or wounded in action. I think there are some assessments that are probably likely closer to the real truth than others. For instance, on the Russia KIA, I think the BBC Media Zone assessments, where they look at sort of death certificates and funerals, are going to be a lot better than battlefield reports that we get every day from Ukraine. But one of the things that I find really unusual and sort of I despair at from an analytical point of view is the amount of government agencies, ministries of defence. I think of the British government's defence intelligence tweets that it puts up every day about the Ukraine war, which simply repeat the Ukrainian MOD's casualty figure, which strangely enough seems to go up the worse the news is on the battleground, because you pointed out the other day, I think it's part of morale management, for the domestic audience and also for their external audience. I can see why Kiev is doing this. That makes perfect sense. But what I struggle with is why so many other, then let's say not just ministries of defence and government agencies, but also media outlets accept these figures almost uncritically. We're seeing that change a little bit. We're seeing, we saw the Economist estimates of KIA and we did an action for Ukraine last week, but that was a relatively recent and rare example of people, not just accepting the official sort of Ukrainian figures and pushing back, saying, well, what do we think the reality actually is? For most of the war, we've seen the media simply repeat figures that are intended for information warfare purposes, as though this was real information. So that is, I think, that has been part of why we've got some things wrong, because a lot of people have believed factoids or assessments that were highly coloured by assessments that weren't serious assessments, in my view. So that's one thing. I think the second then broader factor, and I'm speaking more about the economy here because I know there's been a lot of discussion over why people got the assessments over how the war would go wrong, right? So that's it's not my lane, as it were. But if we think about the economy and those assessments, I spoke about them at the very beginning of the interview, why they were so wrong. Again, I think that for two reasons. One, people fail to appreciate that targets adapt, that if you put in place a big wave of draconian sanctions, that the other side has a say in what happens, right? They're not just going to stand there and get punched in the face. They're also going to start bobbing and weaving and maybe even try and hit you back. That happens. So adaptation is something that people often fail to appreciate. But I also think confirmation bias, again, is just something that sort of permeates a lot of agencies and organizations that should know better. Right, they see things that they want to see, believe it, and of course politicians play a big role in that, because the politicians have an interest in saying this is working and it'll work soon, because they operate very often, according to relatively short timelines, don't they? This year, this month, what's the news headline saying about what it is that we're doing? So I think, apologies if that sounded like quite an arcane answer, but for me, it's those sort of fundamentals that have really coloured some of the assessments and helps explain why so many of them get things wrong. For me, when I do my job, I have to be open to seeing things that I don't, maybe in my personal life want to see. I try to keep those things separate. I try to look at the facts and figures as dispassionately as is possible, and don't let myself be influenced by, what I think might be morally preferable.
Yes, I think you're completely correct that people look on it, through the scope of their own life rather than analyze what you can confirm is true. And I think another big piece in this, you touch on the confirmation bias, which is definitely there. You touch on just taking these numbers as fact. But I think something as well, which plays a big part in politics and journalism and analysts, is criticism. I think this idea that if you have something that goes against that narrative of that Russia's collapsing, Ukraine is winning, and this is exactly how this is going, is if you push back on any of these elements, that therefore you are on the side of Putin, that you are not only witnessing this happen, but you are helping in a way of this happening. And at that point in time, that anything you say is then just cast in that light. And I've put it very closely to when, if someone's losing an argument or they're in an argument someone don't like, well, they can just call them a racist or a sexist. And from that point on, anything that person says, regardless of the point they're making, is seen is just, yeah, that's it. And it seems like the way out is you just paint someone as if they were to come and say, look, the Russian economy is not doing that poorly. It's actually doing quite well in here and here and here. The people go, well, you're just a Putin sympathizer, regardless of where you actually see, morally or ethically this war. That it's that. And I think this large amount of criticism that these politicians, these analysts, or these bloggers will have, I think that has a big influence on what they say or what they are willing to put out there too. Because there's a lot of analysts, there's a lot of people I watch who I'm thinking, there is no way you actually believe this. There's people I see who have spent time in like the military intelligence community who push on some of these ideas, and I'm thinking, the training you've had, the intelligence level you are, unless you've drunk that Kool-Aid to an unbelievable level, you are doing this because there is maybe a financial incentive, maybe that it'll annoy your audience if you say this, or maybe CNN or Fox or MSNBC won't have you on if you push this. So maybe that's being pushed as well. So maybe there's that incentive, and the incentive just not to be ridiculed and criticized online also. I think that has a bigger effect than people actually realize.
All good points. I think in particular on that point there about changing positions. If you're somebody who has a media profile, if you're somebody who's written and it's published, and you change your position, sometimes I think that for certain people, changing your position is seen as worse than getting it wrong. They say, because if I'm not going to name names, but I was reading an interview with somebody who looks at the Russian economy this morning before our interview, and this particular individual was saying, look, the ruble, what happened last week is a sign that things are really bad and we're close to the end game. And then I know, because I follow this particular individual, I've watched this individual's work, that this individual has been saying that for the last not just 3 years but 10 years. Right, this keeps saying very similar things, keeps getting it wrong, but seems quite happy to keep getting it wrong, just as long as there's a demand for that individual's comments, which there are from large parts of I think the media. So this person will keep on turning up and saying the same thing. Now maybe one day that individual is going to be right. This is the sort of stopped clock effect. So I do think that's an element. But where I think this is very dangerous, and this is where I think it is important that we always check our priors, we always check whether or not we're getting something right or wrong. And that's something I have to do, because I've spent the last few years, even before the war, saying things like Russia spends more on its military than people give it credit for, so it's therefore presents more of a military threat. I've been saying that. I've been saying its economy is more resilient to sanctions. I've written this book, so I therefore, come to that conclusion that it wasn't going to crumble under pressure immediately, that it would be able to adapt. So I've been saying things like this, but one day I could well be wrong. At some point, when I was watching what was happening with the Ruble over the last couple of weeks, I had to ask myself the question: are my assessments wrong? Am I getting something wrong here? Is in fact, my sort of model now faulty? So you have to keep asking yourself that question. You have to keep yourself analytically honest, and that's difficult to do, right? It takes a lot of energy to do that. It takes a lot of honesty, but it's important that you do it, because if you don't, then what you have is a lot of people telling ourselves things that we want to hear and getting important things wrong. So if we entered the war thinking, well, Russia will crumble within a few weeks or months under sanctions, therefore we only need to provide Ukraine with some modest military aid and that will do the job, then suddenly your whole policy is sort of predicated on this false assessment, this faulty assessment. Whereas if you'd be more honest and say, well, hang on, this is a country that's likely to be a lot more resilient, it's going to stand up to sanctions, then we have to be prepared for a much longer war. We have to be prepared to entertain other options, like maybe military intervention. I'm not saying I'm suggesting that, but that's something that should be on the table analytically and as a policymaker. But if you believe that the Russian economy is so unhealthy that it's going to fall over, then it really influences the types of choices that you make. If you think that it wastes all of its money on corruption, that it doesn't actually procure any weaponry, and that it's therefore you can get away with saying we don't need to spend 2% of GDP because hey, we spend more than them anyway, and they go and waste it all. And that's where I think bad analysis can lead to very bad policy and complacency. And I think we've seen that over the last 3 years. This sort of wishful thinking that Russia's about to fall over has been used as a justification for not increasing European defense spending, for not taking our own security more seriously, for not ramping up defense industrial production. My view, and I am sharing my own personal beliefs here, is that those are things we should have done. I think there were things we should have done before the war, and we haven't. And I think a lot of that comes from this intersection between faulty analysis and people seeing what they want to see.
Yes, and I think you're completely correct. And coming from a military strategic point of view, tactical point of view, I think that this faulty analysis leaning into propaganda has actually caused the problems we are seeing on the front line in Ukraine at the moment. And I spoke about this recently, that for years and months, we heard the Russian economy is going to collapse. Ukraine is winning everywhere on the battlefield. And now we're seeing what is maybe actually occurring. And what I've said is, if you don't think that can affect things like recruiting, that if you were a young man sitting in Kyiv through maybe the late stage of 22, maybe through to the beginning of 2024, you may go, well, why would I sign up when the economy is about to collapse over the border and everything we are doing, we're inflicting 1,500 to 2,000 killed a day on the Russian forces? Why would then I sign up? And then on the flip side, into these European countries and analysts, well, why would we ramp this up when there's 2,000 Russians a day dying? That means there's going to be 4,000 to 6,000 WIA every day, and the economy is going to collapse. Why would we ramp this up? Why would I recruit? And I say again and again, the problem in Ukraine at the moment is manpower. And I believe a lot of that is, firstly, just due to the savagery of war, and that this is posted online. People can see how brutal war was in wars gone past. The brutality is hidden and it is reserved for those who see it with their own two eyes, which is horrible. But now people are going, I'm not signing up to that. But also this propaganda over years that has caused, well, they don't need any more men, we're all good. Now it's sort of come home to roost. That I think it's had a huge tactical impact from just that informational war in the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. The figures that we're seeing, if you were to just live in the information sphere, and some people with dogs as avatars online appear to do just that. But if you live and you occupy that, then you will think, well, Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure are largely ineffectual because nearly all of these are shot down or redirected to Belarus or back onto Russian territory. So, life's good. This is a very blunt sword, because until recently, we saw sort of 90, 95, sometimes 99% sort of interception rates, even though we saw electricity consumption, and outages take significant declines. This is more not just this year, but in previous winters as well. If we just look at those casualty figures of numbers of people liquidated, then we would assume that Russia, not only Russia running out of men, but it's going to be running out of people it can get from North Korea and elsewhere as well, because 2,000 people dying a day is just enormous. So you're quite right. So why would the Europeans need to spend more on the military? There's not going to be a military to worry about from Russia if we accept these these figures, something happened with the Ukrainian MOD figures at the beginning of the war when they seemed to, according to their official data, shoot down half of the Russian Air Force. Since then, we've seen the plane icon on their dashboard only add the odd aircraft once in a while. They seem to have come to the realization that if they were going to continue at that rate, then they not only would have destroyed the Russian Air Force, but they would have also destroyed the Chinese Air Force as well. So that must account for why they made a sudden change there. But that information is complete and utter nonsense. But some people base their decisions on it, as you quite rightly point out. If you're signing up, well, I think it's different. I think if you're a European power and you're looking at those figures, you think that the Russian military is going to disappear. I think for the Ukrainians who aren't signing up now, maybe they're seeing, as you say, the other realities, what they see online, the stories that they hear from people coming back, or the people who don't come back because they're never rotated, because they can't be, because they're experiencing such shortages. But I think we are at a point now, I think, getting back to this sort of general point where there are limits to what sort of your information campaign can do. There are limits to putting very obvious fictions into the information sphere, what that can achieve. I think it achieved quite a lot in the early days. I think it was very good for morale. I think sometimes it was based on some elements of truth, but I think as time's gone on, that gap between what's been said and reality has grown much larger. But the gap between what a lot of people think is good information, what is bad information, still has actually not extended out as much as it should have done, and that's deeply worrying.
Oh, it's deeply worrying, some of these echo chambers that have been made. And I think these algorithms push echo chambers. And that's what I've said recently. I think the mass move of the pro-Ukrainian NAFO from Twitter to Blue Sky, I said, regardless of which way you feel, I'm not here to influence which way you feel in this, but that's a poor move. You're going to put yourself in an echo chamber, and that isn't good, because you're not going to get the picture of what is actually happening, and that is going to influence how you see things. Same as if you're a pro-Russian just sitting on Telegram instead of Twitter or Blue Sky or Instagram or Facebook. But that is a very dangerous thing that is not only affecting how people see the war, it can affect funding, it can affect recruiting, it can affect everything. But on that point, how much does the corruption in Russia affect the economy as a whole? We hear horror stories about, pieces of boats going missing to be sold, and things happening in the upper echelons of the sort of oligarchs and everything. How much does that actually have an effect? Is it something that we can measure, I guess, almost upon the front line?
I think there are a number of different ways of looking at corruption in Russia. I mean, first point I always make whenever asked the question about this, whether it be in relation to the defense industry or any other aspect of Russian life, is that corruption in Russia is a constant and not a variable. It's always been there. It's always at a relatively high level. The same is true, of course, of most post-Soviet states, including Ukraine. So it always means that things like public spending, whatever money is the headline figure that is available for X, is often in practice diminished by the time it's actually spent and what it's intended for, because a lot of people take their cuts. But in terms of what that means for the battlefield, I mean, that's a problem and I think before the war there was a lot more corruption in procurement, so that there were certain capabilities that existed on paper in Russia but didn't exist in practice because funds and resources had been siphoned off. Now, the thing about a war, of course, is it focuses the mind. If those things aren't reaching the front. And I think that will be happening less. I don't think it's been eliminated by any stretch. As I say, it's a permanent feature of Russian life. But I suspect that more often than not, most of what's intended to get to the front will get there. The amount the amount of leakage it probably declines in conditions of a war, because your coercive capabilities are deployed to a much greater extent. People will be monitoring whether weapons are delivered, and if they're not, people will shout, and then they will crack down on it. As I say, there'll be exceptions to that, but as a tendency, I think leakage is likely to diminish. Difficult to say with any precision, to put a number on that. Economically, I think that the amount of money that's going towards the war effort and the amount of money that's that the Russian government has been spending in general has gone up. You'd expect a lot more corruption and siphoning off to take place with that as well, in absolute terms. So, you know, construction projects in Mariupol, for instance, I'm sure some people got very, very rich off that, and a lot of those funds didn't find their way to their intended purposes. But that doesn't mean that it's an economic dead weight. It means that it's money that gets, you know, it's lots of people taking their cut along the procurement or the public spending line, and that money can still stay within the economy and can still be spent. So the notion that if, you know, corruption exists, that it is a complete loss to an economy, I think is wrong. There's also political effect of corruption. It binds the people involved in the corruption chain to that chain. You know, if I, Willie, am sharing money with you and you're getting a slice of a procurement contract that I have managed to arrange, then we have an interest in keeping this thing going, right? You're going to be loyal to me because you get paid and your family eats as a result of your connection with me. And I might only form, you know, a low or middling part of this whole rung, and I'm loyal to the person above me. And that's what you get in patrimonial systems like this, where corruption plays a big part in the distribution of resources. It binds elites, and often people outside the elite, to the elite. So I think that corruption exists, but it's not always, it doesn't always have the negative impacts that people assume that it does. It's a lot more complicated, this picture. There's a reason why corruption manages to, you know, persist, you know, across the world and throughout time. It's because, you know, people benefit from it.
Oh, absolutely. And I've had people explain to me in Russia and in Ukraine, the corruption, like you said, is just a constant, and it's almost like a tax. It's just like, oh, you know, anything that you're going to do, there's just like an extra tax, like a goods and services tax that we'd have here in Australia or in other countries. It just sort of tacked on to all of that. On a complete, well, I guess it's the same area at least, we've seen President-elect Donald Trump post on Twitter yesterday or the day before talking about if BRICS countries, and he specifically mentions China and Russia, that if the BRICS countries want to form some level of their own currency, that there's going to be a tariff, 100% tariff added onto every product and everything. And a lot of people grabbed onto this tweet about BRICS, and I said, well, BRICS, when you then take in the dollar amount for the purchase parity and purchase power, that actually has a larger GDP of everything combined, and you know, 45% of the earth and 35% of people. I may have those the wrong way around. How do you see that would affect if there was tariffs added? Would that backfire? How much effect would it have had on BRICS, or how much effect would it have on the US? Because many have said this would impact the US far more than it would BRICS. I'm not sure if that's like your wheelhouse, but what do you make of that? I'm not sure if you've seen the tweet. I can read it to you if you'd like.
No, I have seen the tweet, and it's something that I can make a general comment on. Firstly, your point then about the relative distribution of GDP in the world at PPP, at purchasing power parity, is spot on. A simple way of putting it is if you take the G20 and take the G7, the G7 is part of the G20. The G13, that is the non-G7 parts of the G20, now account for a larger proportion of global GDP than the G7. I mean, that wasn't the case 30 years ago. And that, I think, is a very simple indicator of just how dispersed global output is now. And it shows you that, you know, the US and the West, you know, major Western European countries and Japan don't dominate the global economy in the way in which they used to, certainly after World War II. And that's important to note, because then you think, hang on a minute, is the US in a position to be able to enforce its will simply by, you know, writing a tweet or threatening a tariff? Because actually it's up against here, you know, a much more powerful array of economies than the United States on its own. So that's the first point. What would it mean? I mean, if, let's suppose, you know, China, just to take the obvious example, were to de-dollarize. It would be a very gradual process, not something that you would do overnight, but let's suppose that happened over a period of years. And in response to that, the US imposed these enormous tariffs. I mean, he's threatening tariffs on everything that China does at the moment, not just whether or not they choose to de-dollarize, it's whether or not they, the prices of their goods, whether or not they choose to supply fentanyl feedstock to Mexico. I mean, he's threatening this as a response, as a hammer to hit every different type of nail, which is worth noting. If that was to happen, and you impose this tariff, and then that China can no longer sell, it's priced out of exporting to America, then the need for China to buy dollars would be much reduced. I mean, at the moment, the Chinese intervene and buy dollars to keep the value of the renminbi down, right? They do that so that to keep their exports competitive, so that they can sell more to China. The need for that would be obviated if you were to impose this big tariff on them. Now, what would that do? I mean, the one area where the US is still the most powerful country in the world is in financial currency terms, because of the role that the US dollar plays in the global economy. It's only because countries like China and Saudi Arabia and all these other countries that need somewhere safe to park their money, it's only because they buy dollars that the US can run vast budget deficits every year, vast current account deficits every year, and not suffer an extreme financial and economic crisis. The moment that those countries stop buying dollars, the US can't continue spending on the credit card, right? To put it in sort of layman's terms. So it's a weapon that I don't think he'd want to wield, because if people did decide, he imposed those tariffs and people said, well, hang on, what's the point in buying dollars then? And called his bluff, that will be a lot worse for the United States. Now, whether or not that's what would happen, maybe they would come to the negotiating table, maybe there would be some outcome that would suit all parties, that's a possibility. But if we take that extreme scenario where he imposes these draconian tariffs, and then the countries call his bluff and just decide not to abandon the US dollar, not even in its entirety, but just 30–40% from where they are now, that's big trouble for the US economy, and big trouble for the rest of the global economy. So be careful what you wish for, Mr. Trump.
Yeah, look, I'm glad that I was somewhat correct on that, because I said in the video where I presented this, I said, I think if the bluff is called on this could potentially have a large backfire. Now, I wanted you to sort of explain something that I've seen passed around a lot of Russian channels. And I want to know, is this correct? Are they barking up something that's not important? And the quote goes along the lines of, comparing Russia's GDP to a country of a similar GDP, maybe in the West, is incorrect. And they say that Russia is an economy of oil, gas, and grain, not one of spreadsheets and speculation. What do you make of that?
Well, this was something that I used to spend a lot of time talking about. There's some articles online where I have tried to measure Russia's defense expenditure, not at market exchange rates, but instead at PPP. And I did this before the war because it was part of my argument that Russia was spending a lot more on its military than people gave it credit for. And the PPP, the utility of using PPP to assess Russian capabilities was a big part of my argument. So there's some papers online where I've spoken about this, but this was well before the war. So it's something that I'm very familiar with, this argument. So if you take market exchange rates, Russia's not even in the top 10 in the world. In fact, it would have just got smaller because of this recent run on the ruble. Whereas if you use the purchasing power parity exchange rate, that adjusts for differences in costs within that economy. And usually it's used to measure differences in welfare across countries. So for instance, if we might say, the average Chinese citizen has, a market exchange rate income of $2,000 or $3,000, but they have a very much higher living standard. They have their own home, maybe they drive a car, they eat out in restaurants. You say, well, how does that square with 2,000 or 3,000? Surely you'd need to earn more. And it would be the PPP exchange rate that would explain that, because you'd say, well, yes, because your dollar goes a lot further in rural China, for instance. And the same applies for Russia. I don't know if you've been to Russia, or maybe many of your listeners, but when I used to teach in Russia and I spent a lot of time there, the cost of an Uber was about 3 times less than what I would pay in New York or London. right? So to get around the city for a half an hour Uber drive wouldn't cost me very much at all. It would cost me a fraction. And the same was true for, my McDonald's, or I don't eat McDonald's, but I use that because it's the Economist's Big Mac exchange rate example. But true of lots of other non-tradable goods. If you wanted a haircut, a taxi ride, if you wanted to go to buy a baked potato from a fast food stand, all of these things were a lot cheaper. So your money went a lot further. And that's what PPP exchange rates are used. They used to show how the dollar can actually go a lot further in countries like this, where the cost of labor, the cost of land is a lot smaller. Now, PPP isn't perfect. There are problems, especially if you're talking about traded goods or financial flows. There, it's probably better to use market exchange rates. So I'm wary here that I'm probably overcomplicating things for you and your viewers. But I just want to make the point, because if you've got an economist watching this, they'll go, well, hang on, PPP is not perfect. And it isn't. But market exchange rates aren't perfect either. So you have to exercise a bit of caution over which figure you use. Now, let's just take the military spending example, because this is the one close to my heart and that I've done a lot of work on. If you look at the current budget, at market exchange rates, Russia's military expenditure for 2024 is going to be about $130 billion. Now, that's about twice the UK, which spends about $65 billion, twice France. But, and a fraction of the US at about $900 billion. So you'd say, it's large. It's still the third or fourth largest in the world, behind America and China, but it's a long way off. But if you look at it at PPP, it's actually closer to $400 billion, right? And this is one way I use the smell test. What do you think if we say you've got a country that's got the largest, most modern strategic nuclear arsenal in the world? This is Russia, right? It's updated and overhauled its ICBM and SLBM stock over the last decade. Got that. It's got the third largest navy, albeit a very old one and in quite some state of disrepair, or at least for surface vessels. It's got an army of knocking on for 1 million now. It's fighting a large-scale, intense war where it's using vast amounts of UAVs, armored platforms, munitions, everything that you follow. It's paying its personnel more than it's ever paid before. Now, it's got large military intelligence services, foreign intelligence services, etc. It's got a large Rosguardia, a large paramilitary force for keeping order at home. How the hell do you do that on just $130 billion a year? You don't. The PPP figure actually helps you explain why Russia can do all of that and can be active in Africa, can still build vast amounts of weaponry. It's able to do this because the PPP is a more accurate way of assessing it, because Russia does not pay its bills in dollars, it pays them in rubles. And PPP gives you a greater sense of its sort of ruble expenditure capacity. So I think that, and if we look at PPP and we measure Russia's GDP, it's the fourth or fifth largest in the world. That's not according to the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov. This is according to the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank have Russia as the fourth largest economy in the world, and the IMF they use a slightly different PPP deflator, but they have Russia as the fifth. But either way, it's the largest one in Europe, and it can support this much larger military expenditure burden that of 400 billion that I've spoken about there. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but I'd say it's much closer to the 400 billion than it is to the 130.
Is that reason that we brought up about, they're an economy of basically shit you can grow in the ground or dig out of the ground. Does that protect Russia more from sanctions than maybe some other countries would? Like if these sanctions got put onto some other economies, like they will say economies of spreadsheets and speculation, is one of the reasons Russia may be a bit more protected by these sanctions is because at the end of the day, what they're selling is oil, gas, food, or the basic bits of food. Is that one thing that can protect against sanctions?
That's certainly one thing, and it's one thing that helps when you're fighting a war as well. If you've got a lot of natural resources and you're able to feed yourself, that you're not subject to other countries interdicting your food supply. And Russia's Russia's exported about $45 billion worth of food last year. So not only can it feed itself, but it's also the third largest exporter of food in the world, the largest exporter of grain. So those things help. But I will go a step further, and again, I think this is, to correct some of the analysis. I think what we've just said there is still part of the Russia is a gas station with missiles, sort of John McCain type of argument. There's a lot more than that. Russia's, this is according to UN figures before the war. Russia was the 6th or 7th largest manufacturer in the world by manufacturing value added. And that's by value added. If you look at employment, it's even bigger. So it's not just that it can produce a lot of food and natural resources and dig things up out of the ground. It can do those things, and they're very useful. But it's also some manufacturing. This is a population of 145 million with a very advanced scientific and technological base, a well-educated, comparatively, population. And with a lot of people working in factories. Now, a lot of those factories are archaic, and some of them haven't been updated since the Soviet period, but a lot have, and a lot are much more modern than people might expect. Anybody who's traveled to a big Russian city in the period before the war will know that big Russian city centre is much like a big Russian city, a city centre in Australia or Europe or the United States. There are internet, Wi-Fi on the your metro. There are sushi bars. There are factories producing consumer goods, etc. So and restaurants producing high-end food. This is not some, parts of it are a backwater for sure, but it's a real kaleidoscope of different sort of economic capabilities. So it's not just a natural resource story. It has that in abundance, but it also has a much more sophisticated manufacturing and services base than people would expect. And that's going back to that point I made earlier about this quite vibrant small and medium-sized business sector of the economy. These are the people that provide those goods and services, and they do a pretty good job.
I think you're reading my mind, because my next question I've actually written down on one of my cards is basically from your experience in Russia. A lot of people view Russia through information or whatever as to quote, and I've written down the same word, a backwater country with savages in it. That's how many people are selling Russia, which is, I've never been to Russia, but if you look at Moscow, you go, well, that's not that. And myself, I'm a big fan of literature from the Russian greats, and I'm a big fan of physics. And it tells you straight away, like, well, there have always been, whether it's Soviet era, or whoever, whether it's under the SARS or whoever through to currently, Russia can really lead in areas of physics, particularly say like nuclear physics, and literature has always been absolute. There's a reason why the term Russian greats exists. What is your response as not only someone who is an expert in the economy, but someone who's lived and taught in Russia about this idea that these are backwater savages that can't adapt, that can't create?
I mean, I think that the short answer is, of course, that is nonsense. From a scientific and technological point of view, Russia, before the Soviet Union, has been the source of a lot of ideas. They're capable of advanced research. Now, there's some truth in the idea that even though they're capable of generating ideas, that those ideas often aren't diffused or absorbed in the economy because of the way in which the economy is structured, right? So, what am I saying here? I'm saying that the idea that they're all sort of savages is complete nonsense and is an extreme argument. The reality, of course, is a bit different. Let's just take per capita income and look at the distribution across Russia. There's a Russian sociologist, Natalia Zubarevich, and she describes, this was some years ago, she came up with this idea that there are 4 Russias. And she had, the first Russia would be the big cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, Tomsk. These are places where, they've got large middle classes, a vibrant services sector, lots of nice restaurants and manufacturing and high skilled employment, etc. And incomes are much higher. And then she'd go down to a second Russia, which was the more sort of Rust Belt parts of the economy, Chelyabinsk, Nizhny Tagil, where Ravagonzavod, the big tank factory, is located. People engaging in a lot more metal banging activities. Incomes are lower, but people still had a reasonable, standard of living, but they weren't quite as, sophisticated, for want of a better word, as those living in the bigger cities. Then we get down to the third Russia, people working in the countryside on farms, As I say, agriculture is a big part of the Russian economy today. And they live a different life. And then you had this fourth Russia, which was just, it was going backwards almost. This is people living in abandoned parts of Russia, experiencing extreme poverty. So again, I use the word kaleidoscope. Russia is a big country with all sorts of different types of experience, all different types of income, all different types of levels of innovation and lived experience. And we need to bear that in mind. And in that respect, it's no different to any other country, right? That's the same of Australia. It's the same as the United States. It's the same as the United Kingdom. You get some parts that are very poor and are almost barbarian. I won't say which parts of Australia I'm thinking of, Willie. But you know, this happens everywhere. This happens everywhere. So I think, you know, Russia's no different in that respect. And it does allocate a large percentage of its GDP towards research and development for military-related things. So things like nuclear physics, AI, the state spends a lot of money. It doesn't spend a lot of GDP on R&D for more civilian-oriented activities. So just to give you an example, you know, the average for an advanced economy is you spend about 2% of GDP on research and development every year. Russia spends 1%. Right, so half of that. However, most of that 1% is diverted towards military-related activities. So nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, nuclear physics, AI, biotech, etc. So the vast proportion, and that's one of the reasons why Russia's still able, despite spending allocating a smaller proportion of its output on R&D, is still able to keep up in developing relatively advanced weaponry, because that's what it considers to be important. That's what its government considers to be important. So all of this is maybe a convoluted way of saying it's not the story that you said that. It's capable of a lot of advanced thinking, research and development, but it tends to be concentrated in a few areas. And those areas tend to be those related to security or the military, because that's where the state is most interested.
Yeah, I think a good example of this, if people want like something that's very measurable, is nuclear propulsion and icebreakers, where that is semi-military civilian. It'll be claimed as one or the other amongst everyone. And you can see that there is a huge advancement in that particular area, particularly with other players as well. And you can see where that propulsion has really moved ahead of other countries. And it's very easy to see. And I talk a lot about the problems that Russia and China have in protracted war can really end up actually solving out a little bit. There's things that China is looking for that in protracted war would be a problem for them, you know, and the most simple ones is really naval ports, grain, and high efficient engines, both on nuclear propulsion and jet propulsion. And the other side for Russia, just raw industrial capacity, doesn't have what China has, and it could. That's the threat there, I guess, of some level of like BRICS economic alliance, because people say it's not a defensive alliance, it's not a military alliance. Well, economies, if Russia is focused on a lot of its spending in military, it's all intertwined. You push here and it pulls over there. What do you say to the idea you've said earlier in the video about, you know, Russia's defense spending is around that like 7% mark? What we saw in the Soviet Union was like 15 to 25%. You mentioned that Ukraine's economy is spending about 30% on defense spending. Of course, that is massively backfilled by money, military aid coming in from the West. But how is this war then affecting Western economies who are supporting Ukraine? Because we've seen, of course, inflation rise in Russia and the ruble reduce in value. We've seen these other factors, but you could say that we've seen similar happen in some Western states as well. Is it affected by Ukraine, or is it other factors that are affecting some of the record high inflation that we're seeing?
I think you've in some ways answered your own question there. I think that there's a lot of what's going on with the war is it accounts for a relatively small proportion of what's going on in European economies. Let's say the German economy is a good example. You know, a lot of people have pointed to the fact that, you know, the end of cheap Russian gas, which had played a big part in German industry from the 1960s, so going back to the Soviet period, a lot of German industry has been competitive precisely because it had much cheaper gas than its competitors. than the United States and Japanese producers, for instance. So people working in the German petrochemicals industry, ceramics, manufacturing, they were able to get cheaper electricity, cheaper feedstock from Russia for decades. And of course, this has come almost to a halt. I say almost because Europe does still bring in some liquefied natural gas from Russia, although pipeline gas has largely disappeared, apart from a few Central European countries. But so if we look at that, the end of that has certainly played a big part in German industry's recent woes. However, it's not the only thing, right? There are other elements that the German auto industry didn't make bets on electric vehicles in the way in which the Chinese and the Americans did, for instance. So it's fallen behind there. They've had some other problems to do with a lack of spending on infrastructure, etc. So the Russian gas story is part of it, but it's not, it's not all of it. And if we look at other countries within Europe, the Russian gas story really doesn't explain much at all. And so the breakdown of economic relations with Russia, for instance, is not going to have a big impact on the Portuguese or the Spanish economy, or to a lesser extent the UK economy. We haven't spent that much in Europe on military aid collectively. So you go back to military aid a minute ago. So if we look at Ukraine, if it spends roughly, I think it's budgeted, the Ukrainian 2025 budget is about $45 billion if we measure it in dollars, and it's which is appropriate to do. All of that will come from abroad, right? That roughly amounts to the military aid that's being allocated to Ukraine next year. So that comes to the United States, Japan, and the EU. You spread that across 35 countries, and it's not, it's not that much given that the collective GDP. So you can't say the Ukraine war is costing our countries a great deal fiscally either. The problem is that those economies have got their own structural problems, and that's causing budgets to be very tight, as we're seeing in France at the moment, as we've seen in Italy in recent years, as we've seen in the United Kingdom. So even $1 billion here or $1 billion there seems like a lot of money. And that's when, questions over how much can we transfer to Ukraine seem to be important to voters. Because if you're, to give you a UK example, if you're going to cut subsidies to the elderly in the winter for their heating bills by £1.5 billion, and then at the same time announce £1.5 million of military aid to Ukraine, voters see that as the price that you're paying. You're cutting aid for the elderly in order to transfer weaponry to Ukraine. The numbers that we're talking about are not that vast, but because the budgets are so tight, people have been asked to make those sorts of choices. And I think that's worth bearing in mind when we look at this. The size of the European economy and the Western economy, we should in principle be able to provide a lot more money to Ukraine than we do. But it's because we're experiencing these tight budgets that's not the reality of how it's experienced by your average European or Western voter.
And I guess you touched on there, it's sort of double pronged in a way that, Germany is giving a lot of money to Ukraine in either hardware or aid, but then at the same time, their cheap gas, of which they were having to develop that equipment in the first place and fund the GDP, has been cut off through things like Nord Stream. So I guess it's two-pronged, that not only is there a lot of money going to Ukraine, but your GDP has been hit with issues that are exacerbated by the cut off of maybe the cheap oil, gas, etc. Do you see a lifting of sanctions in the near future, and these countries in Central Western Europe returning back to that cheap Russian gas at some point?
I think there's some lifting of sanctions is possible in the event of a peace deal. Much depends on what type of peace deal would emerge. I think for as long as the war carries on at the moment, then no, we're not going to see any lifting of sanctions. It'll stay in place. If there's a peace deal that's one where Ukraine has to make a lot of concessions, maybe I think you'll still see a lot of sanctions remain in place. I don't see them all being lifted, but you might see some relief. It depends on which sanctions we're talking about as to where that relief would take place. I think on the gas front, it's going to be very, very difficult for these countries to go back to where they were before, simply because the predictability of your contract has been sort of blown up. You know, it's not just that gas has been cut off. Gazprom has been involved in legal claims in European arbitration courts over the last few years. So it'd be very difficult to imagine a scenario where European firms go back to signing long-term contracts with Gazprom, knowing that this could always happen again. In that respect, I think there's been permanent damage done to the gas relationship and to Gazprom. Europeans will pay a lot higher amount for gas as a result in the future, and Russia will have lower revenues. It'll be both sides will have lost. The winners in that will be probably the United States, because it will export LNG, and Australia and Qatar, and countries that export large volumes of LNG, and they'll export it to Europe at a higher price and make money off it. So, you know, the war's being fought in Europe, and the sanctions are principally between the European powers, but they're the ones who will all have lost, and those who will gain the most will be countries located outside Europe. So yeah, I don't see the gas relationship returning to where it was before. There might be some other areas where, you know, economic relations are restored. But I think this is a big point. I do think that with the last 3 years, it could really, I think Russia has been, throughout its 500-600-year history, a European economy. You know, its center of economic gravity has been west of the Ural Mountains, and its trade has been with Europe. That has really changed in the last 3 years. The trade with Europe in this year will account for around less than 20% of Russia's trade. That's an amazing sort of epochal type of event to have taken place. Russia is now very much a Eurasian economy, principally China, but also, you know, Central Asian economies, South Caucasus, the Middle East, Turkey. This is where its economic center of gravity is now shifted south and east. And it's really, those types of things are structural in nature. They are based on millions of decisions being made, millions of contracts being formed, and they're therefore, as a result, very difficult to reverse. It would take maybe decades or generations to reverse that. The fact that it's happened in just 3 years is something that I think has not been appreciated. It will be one maybe for historians in the future to look at what just, you know, the importance, the magnitude of what has happened.
Yes, and in many ways, as you said, that has sped up that process so much. And then we see people like Vladimir Putin, we see people like Sergei Lavrov, we see Peskov, even down to philosophers like Dugin talk about the rise of the global south and the beginning of a more multipolar world. And this is something you say here, you know, Russia's center of gravity economically has really been Europe centered, and now it's really shifting across to Asia in many ways. And well, Asia is developing incredibly quickly. There's global south, or the rise of the global south, and even in things like grain, is more people in Asia are eating meat, so therefore there's more need for grain. And you touch on that Europe will be maybe affected, but a country like Australia, as I've said, this war economically could be very good for Australia. Our main business is we export gas, meat, and grain. We're a huge exporter of these, and uranium. And the main competitor, one of the primary competitors on this, is Russia. Different area of the world, but still funneling into areas that may be sanctioned. We could benefit a lot from this. And a personal note here, I do think it's disgusting that a lot of people say, oh, this is a good thing for our economy, but it's at the expense of people's lives in Eastern Europe somewhere, and they're focused on their own economy. But that is something that is this huge shift that I think is underappreciated at the moment, is this shift away from Europe and into the global south. And how much effect is that going to have further down the line? And I even look at populations, and I'm like, you know, Russia, of course, it's not beating its replacement rate. It's not close, but the West isn't either. And are they tying themselves to countries that are meeting that? And we are not tying ourselves to countries that are meeting it. We're tying internally. How much effect is that going to have down the line? And this leads into my next question, is what do you believe the near to middle term future holds for the Russian economy over the next 2 to 5 years? Will these sanctions, because the way I had it explained before, and the way I've said this before, and you touched on this, was sanctions have this sort of, they're slow to come into effect, then they come into effect, but then gradually taper off their effectiveness as there's adaptation to them. What do you think the future holds as far as how the economy will run? Will there be a plateau, and how will these sanctions continue to affect, or will it be less?
Well, as ever with these types of questions, I can be more confident, the closer to now that I'm speaking about. So, looking, for the next year or two, absent a collapse in the price of oil. If that happens, Russia's always, it has a much more diverse economy than people appreciate, but nevertheless, oil is still the single most important variable that you want to look at if you're sort of trying to predict what's going to go on in Russia. If oil prices stay roughly where they are, then I see for the next 5 years Russia being able to tick along. I don't think it's going to grow as quickly as it has done over the last 2 years. I think that rate of growth will slow, partially to do with labour shortages, but to do with some other factors too. But it nevertheless should still grow. And that's the main thing. If it's continuing to grow, even if it's at 1 or 2% rather than 3 or 4%, which we've seen over the last 2 years, then I think that will be enough for it to carry on its current course. People's incomes will be such that they won't be coming out into the streets and protesting and wanting to overthrow whoever's in the Kremlin, and Russia will still be able to sustain this large military expenditure and the war if it continues. What would alter that that forecast? I won't call it a forecast. That's too grandiose a word. But what would alter that would be if the price of oil were to go down to $30-40 a barrel and stay there. That will cause some problems for Russia then, and I think then you'd see some very worried people in the Ministry of Finance and then in the Kremlin, because then you're going to have to make do with a smaller amount of resources. On the flip side, if the price of oil goes up, Russia could do even better, and that's the other thing here. I mean, Russia, the price of oil at the moment is around about $70-75 a barrel. If the Chinese economy were to pick up in the next year or two, in 3 or 4, then that could help Russia. Russia's economic fortunes are very much now tied, because of this shift in economic gravity, to China and to a lesser extent India. India is the second biggest buyer of Russian crude. So if India and China are booming, that's good for Russia. And in some ways, Russia will benefit more from that than, let's say, Europe will from those parts of the global economy doing well. So I guess most of my answer there relates to the price of oil. I don't see sanctions as really changing that much, because even if you sanction Russian oil, i.e. secondary sanctions, you say to India, we'll sanction you if you buy Russian oil. That would perhaps reduce the volume of oil that Russia could sell on the global market, but it would be compensated by an increase in the price of oil, because you've just got to cut the amount of oil that can reach the global market. And so in the end, the ruble value of what Russia would sell would probably be more or less the same. So I don't even see secondary sanctions on Russia as being something that would have a decisive impact, and that's probably the next, step for sanctions. I think that will be probably something that would cause more of an impact on the sanctioning countries than Russia. So I don't see sanctions as playing that big a role, and in particular for as long as China keeps trading with Russia. This isn't the Cold War where the Soviet Union was the second pole to the United States first. This is where the world's largest economy at PPP is trading with Russia. Now, some of this trade is interrupted by US sanctions, but a lot of it is carrying on, and Russians and Chinese companies and individuals are finding ways to get around this. And they will continue to do so, because it's in both countries' interests to not let the United States get its own way. So I think for as long as the price of oil doesn't crater, and for as long as Russia can continue to trade with China, I think that Russia should more or less be able to continue on its current course. And therefore, Western powers should act accordingly and prepare accordingly. Don't assume that this is going to be, the Achilles heel that's going to deliver us victory on a plate, albeit 3 years later than we thought that it would. I think we need to prepare for the long haul.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there that, yes, even if there's, a sanction on this oil and less is being supplied, the demand is still going to be there, and it may then increase the price. And I've seen a lot of people say, and I've read a lot around when Ukraine, will have a drone strike on an oil storage facility in Russia, people will go, well, what you're doing though is you're reducing the supply. The demand is still there, and that therefore may increase Russia's cash flow, as it may actually increase that price per barrel. That I've seen people say this could actually have an opposite effect of what you're wanting.
There are all sorts of unintended consequences with whether it be sanctions or strikes on oil refineries or if you were to take out a grain terminal and then that causes a spike in food prices, that could mean that Russia's income would not be affected, but you would see prices rise in the Middle East, which could cause, for example, political instability that would cost both the countries of the Middle East and Western countries even more. So there are all sorts of second and third order, effects of our actions that very often aren't taken into account. As well as that point about adaptation. It's a very, Russia going into the war and remains a very integrated part of the global economy. It's very open to trade, much more open to trade than, for instance, the United States. Trade as a proportion of GDP is much higher in Russia than it is in the US. And so what happens in Russia has a big impact on all of these different markets and different parts of the world. And those impacts aren't obvious or linear, as you've just pointed out. So, you have to think about what these second and third order impacts are when you're designing your sort of sanctions policies.
I think too that there needs to be, and we won't touch on this, but I think there needs to be some thought put into countries that Russia will trade with that we may not as well, or regimes that they will trade with. Like, we are not going to open trade to North Korea. We're not going to open trade with the Taliban in Afghanistan, which we are seeing Russia opening up more ways to do business per se, both military, economically, whatever, with countries like this too, that they may be more willing to actually open some of that up as well. I guess on our last point is I came into this bit blind because I'm like, I don't even know. You don't know what you don't know. I was like, I don't know what questions I should, like, I listed down 15 or 20 sort of talking points, but is there anything that you believe that we have missed that is important piece in this puzzle?
Not really. I mean, I've just noted it's been about 2 hours, so we have covered a lot of ground. I think the key points I wanted to make were to do with the nature of adaptation to sanctions. We've covered that, the resilience of the Russian economy in general, and how that resilience is often founded not just on the state, but also on quite a healthy market. I think that's important if any of your listeners have made it the full way through to appreciate. I think it's important to recognize the PPP point about the fact the Russian economy is much larger than people think, and therefore, as a logical corollary of that, its military expenditure is a lot higher, and so therefore, sorry, my I don't know what's been going. My
that's all right.
Headphones, yeah, they're willing. I'll try and get close to the microphone. So I'll start that again. So the Russian economy is a lot bigger than people give it credit for, and its military expenditure is a lot bigger than it's given credit for. But I think perhaps me going into this conversation, I hadn't expected to talk about, as we did, the sort of analytical failures that people make, and this sort of tendency towards confirmation bias, or as it's otherwise known, wishful thinking. I think it's really important that regardless of where you sit and what you want to happen, that people try to be honest when they review the evidence, because it's only by doing that that we're going to be in a better position to put better information, as you do, into the sort of information sphere, so the things that people consume, but also hopefully influence how policymakers think about these problems by doing it with better information. That's not prejudicing what they do with that information, but at least making a contribution to people doing the job of analysing what's happening here in Russia and elsewhere, and policymaking in general, doing that job more professionally and in a better way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Dr. Connolly, where can people, I guess, follow any of your work? And I'd love you, if you've got a copy of your book there, where people can get a copy of it as well.
I'm not a big social media person, so I follow people on Twitter, and I go onto YouTube. I don't do any of this myself. I'm too busy. But I do write publicly. I've got a couple of books. There was a book it's a very dry academic book on how Russia responded to the 2014 sanctions. That's on Amazon. Richard Connolly, it's Russia's response to sanctions. I've written a book, a very short one for the general reader, on the Russian economy. That's published by Oxford University Press. They've got these very short introductions. You may have seen them in bookshops, on Plato and God. I wrote the one
the Russian economy. And a lot of the points that I've made today are covered there, and there's a bit of history as well. And it's the sort of thing you can read in an afternoon if the Russian economy interests you. I'm just writing a second edition of it now for the that takes into account the war and sanctions. But other than that, I periodically pop up on RUSI or sort of think tanks and write academically or occasionally for the press. But those are the books, and there's I think the small one is probably the best one for those who are interested in the economy. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, mate, I've kept you for 2 hours. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, as well as spending time with me to talk about this very complex thing, and you reaching out to me, and in your email saying like, look, I've seen that you've mentioned, that you're not qualified to speak on this. I might be someone to be able to help you, mate. It's fantastic. So I really can't thank you enough. And look, anytime there's anything you want to talk about, if it's on my platform to discuss something, please just let me know, whether it's written text or an interview like this, and it could go as long or as short as you'd like. Please, the door is always more than open.
Well, thank you, Willie, and ditto to you. If ever there's a question in defence industry, military spending, stuff to do with what we've spoken about today, feel free to drop me a line, and I can always send you an email, as you say, or we can have a chat. So keep in touch in that respect. I also work for a geopolitical risk company called Oxford Analytica. That's not to be confused with Cambridge Analytica, who were accused of influencing the US election back in 2016. But we have a lot of short stuff that we write on things that might interest you. So what I might do is they're I say short, they're about 1,000 words, but they're written for sort of clients in government and big business who don't have the time to read long articles. And I write a lot of these. And if anything's to do with the Russian economy or the war, I'll perhaps drop them a line. You don't have to acknowledge receipt, but they're there to just give you some info if you so desire. But so I'll keep in touch. But it's been lovely talking to you, and I'm so impressed by your energy. I mean, it's going to be late into the evening in Australia. I see you did another interview. You're going to have, no doubt, your usual program as well, which now seems to be carrying out 7 days a week. So you're an inspiration. I lack the energy to do this.
Oh, no, mate. I've had it. Well, today's been a one-off day. It's been a much larger day because I had the video, some other personal stuff. I'm still dealing with trying to fix the internet here, but then I also had to go see my neurosurgeon. So it's been a hell of a day.
How you do that as well?
That's all right. Well, look, I'm glad we talked this week because I believe that I'm starting chemotherapy, I believe, on Monday coming. So we will see. But I really appreciate your time, man.
Well, it goes without saying, best of luck with that. I really hope that goes well, but keep it up with the work to the extent that you can. It's really appreciated. I think you do a wonderful job. It's balanced, it's insightful, even-handed, and really refreshing. I've enjoyed it, and I recommend it to plenty of people. So keep it up.
Easy. Thank you, mate. Well, look, I'm going to log off, and I'm going to go have some dinner. But you have a fantastic day. Wait, okay. Thank you, Richard.
Cheers, Willie. Bye-bye.